Okay, well, first off, I'm really happy to be presenting today. I did come in a little bit late, I apologize, so I can make my introductions to you after I give this presentation. I do work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Sarah Warner, and I'm based out of the Madison field office. I just want to show you right now the partners that are involved in this. This is specific to the Poweshiek Skipperling risk assessment that we're doing together. And I know the main focus of my presentation is on this specific risk assessment for this species. Before I get into that, though, I want to talk about risk assessment, risk management in general. And Chris did talk quite a bit about this. I have a very simplified version of this to show you compared to some of Chris's slides. I think it's really important for us to understand this framework and to understand a lot about what Chris was talking about and also where we can influence. Okay. So, why are we even here today? So we're all here as a community to talk about science. So what science is needed? This is a really tough question. So with limited funding that we have, what decisions are we going to make where we really see a conservation impact on the ground? It's really difficult. So how do we even approach this really large question? There are ways that we can approach this question that can increase our certainty in the science that we do apply. And that's what I'm going to talk to you first about. So the intent of my presentation is to discuss a strategy that we're using in the Poweshiek Skipperling risk assessment to make these decisions. And this is a strategy that helps us determine what science needs are, what the science needs are, therefore what research we should do, all within a risk management, risk assessment framework. So you're going to hear those words a lot, and I hope they get embedded in your mind, risk assessment, risk management. And I have other pictures here. I think it's also important to keep in mind what we're talking about in this room. It's not specific to the Poweshiek Skipperling. It's really specific to all pollinators. What we decide to do in terms of science and what we apply on the landscape is going to have an impact on monarch. The pictures I have here are the monarch, Mitchell satyr, rusty patch bumblebee. These are all species that are in decline. These are all species that are impacted by chemical use on the landscape. So this is sort of risk assessment, risk management, kind of 101. In order to do risk management, you first have to assess. You have to do a risk assessment. What are the risks? What are those threats? And then once you can answer that question, then you can do management, risk management. Then you can determine what actions are we actually going to do on the ground that feed into our risk assessment. So risk assessment, I put up some of the factors that are involved in this risk assessment, risk management. It is complex. There are a number of different variables that go into both of these things into determining risk assessment and therefore risk management. This is what we use to determine risk management. And it's not really a recipe. It's not something that you just follow. So some of these factors, these risk management factors, are going to they're going to influence you at different sites with different questions that you're asking. So sometimes you may have social factor that comes into play that you need to consider, or you might have a public value factor that comes into play that you need to consider. Other sites, other projects that you're working on, these might not be an influence. So as risk managers and as conservation biologists, we get the fun job of trying to figure out how to balance all of these and use all of these to help us make the right decisions on the ground. So this is my more simplistic figure. So Chris showed you more detail. This is very simplistic, but maybe it will help us to wrap our brain around it a little bit more. So this is what I'm showing you right now is risk assessment, risk management framework. So again, this is what we're using for the Poweshiek, but this is what we can use for everything, for all pollinators. And you start off this with toxicity. So this is sort of like an equation. So you have your toxicity times exposure. That gives you your effects. So in this circumstance, we're talking about toxicity from an insecticide. and then exposure to a non-target. So we've been talking a lot about Poweshiek skipperlings, but it could be a number of our other pollinators. That will give you an effect. From there, you are able to make a risk evaluation and risk determination. That feeds into risk management. So how I like to think about this, so again, this is the framework that we're operating under. And this is a continuum. This is a flow. This is a circle. So you're not just working on one aspect at a time. You're working on many of these at a time. So your toxicity, your exposure effects determines risk determination, and that impacts your risk management. What your actions are for risk management then feeds back to your toxicity, and that feeds back to your exposure. So say you have a risk management action on the ground that lowers exposure. That's going to change your effects. So you're always using this. You're always in this circle. You're always working within this. This is always changing. So this is a framework that we use, and this is what we're using for Poweshiek. So another aspect of this, which is really important, and this really ties in a lot with what Chris just talked to you about, is risk management. And what are we talking about when we say that word, risk management? There's two categories of risk management. This is where we can work. This is where we can have an influence. This is where we can have our actions influence. So we have our regulatory category of risk management. Chris just talked to you a lot about pesticide regulation. At the federal level, this is also at a state level. So we can influence this, pesticide toxicity testing and also labeling. So what we decide to do with our science and with our research can influence this category. Also, pest management support. So this is sort of the practical things that can be done on the ground. So some examples of this could be having a different type of nozzle on your spray applicator that's going to make the droplet size larger. When the droplet size is larger, you're reducing your drift. Another example would be making sure that you're spraying closer to the crop. If you're spraying closer to the crop, you're going to reduce drift. So these are some real practical things that can be applied in the field that we, with what we decide today, can influence. So then again, all of this, whatever we decide to do, our actions, is going to impact risk management. In turn, that could lower exposure, lower effects. So this is all working together in this circle. Okay, so now I'm going to get into how we're applying this framework, this risk assessment, risk management framework, specifically for the Poweshiek skipperling. And what this is showing you is essentially that framework that you just saw. So we have this environmental setting and source, pathway, and effects. This is our exposure part of that equation. This is the science. So science fits into here. Research questions fit into this up here. Then we have our toxicity information, again, risk evaluation, and then risk management. So it's essentially the same diagram that I just showed you. This is how we've modified it specifically for Poweshiek skipperling. And what I'm going to talk to you about is where we are today. This isn't finished. We are working on environmental setting, source, pathway, and effects. The hardest thing about this is figuring out exposure. Exposure is so difficult, but it is so important. It's one of the most important aspects of risk assessment, risk management. If you can figure out exposure, then you can figure out what your effects are. Then you can figure out how to mitigate those effects with risk management techniques. So this is for the Poweshiek skipperling. We are actually focused on all of these sites. These are, well, the sites in Michigan are the sites where we still have Poweshiek skipperling. Possibly at one site in Wisconsin. We think that we don't have them anymore at our second site, Skipperling Prairie. But this is our environmental setting. Most of this that I'm going to show you is focusing on the Michigan sites where we still actually have the skipperling in existence. And so I'm going to show you some maps. So remember, if you think back to that diagram, we're in the trying to determine exposure, which is super hard. So what do you have to do? First, you want to figure out what the landscape characterization is. So what is the exposure potential? And how you do this is really a GIS exercise. So this is our Long Lake Fen site in Michigan. This is where we have, and Phil probably talked to you about this, but this is where we have the highest numbers of Poweshiek today. And so, of course, we're in that exposure question. Are they even being exposed? What are they exposed to? You can't do anything with risk management unless you can answer that question. So here we go. This is just a picture of the site. Phil probably showed you this figure. These are our numbers here. You can see we have had a pretty steep population decline at the site. 2015, I believe that says 30 individuals were observed. And this is the site. Those red dots are where Poweshiek individuals have been observed. And then what we're doing to answer exposure is first we're trying to figure out, well, how much agriculture is around the site? Where is the ag? You can see that pink outline, that's a golf course. We know that chemicals, insecticides are used on golf courses. So we're not only looking at ag, but we're looking at other sources. Chemicals used for pests, insecticides used for pests, that's just one source. There's other sources out there. A lot of chemicals, insecticides are used on home and gardens. We use mosquiticides. DNRs can spray for larvicides. So there's a lot of different sources out there. So this is where we still have Poweshiek in existence. Halstead Lake, we still have Poweshiek in existence. And I'm only showing you 4 of our sites here. But here you can see we delineated where the agriculture is. You can see how close that is to the site and what's in between the site and the ag. Goose Creek grasslands is where we do not have Poweshiek anymore. I believe they were last seen at the site in 2013. This is sort of a different picture here. So when you delineate the ag, when you have an understanding of what's around the site, you can see that we do have, all we can really say here at this point is we do have more agricultural land around the site, surrounding the site. And this is Grand River Fen. So again, we have a lot more eggs surrounding this site. We do not have Poweshiek skipperling here anymore. So this is part of that landscape characterization. So this is, again, answering that exposure. This is also answering, we're digging more now into exposure. So working with our colleagues at Michigan Natural Features Inventory, they worked on this drift model. And I'm not going to get into the details of the model at all, but what they were able to do is characterize within that prevailing wind direction what percentage of ag land is within that area. So the triangles that you see that's the area that they were analyzing. That's the prevailing wind direction. And you can see here when they did their analysis, Grand River Fen and Goose Creek are the 2 sites. Now those are the sites where we don't have Poweshiek anymore. Those are the 2 sites where we have the highest percentage of agriculture land within that drift triangle. So again, this is just part of the analysis. This is one aspect of it. So this is Long Lake Fen again. And I just want to say really quickly, the next step that we're doing is really trying to figure out what the ag fields are. You need to understand what the ag fields are, what the pests are, in order to understand what chemicals are being used. So from here, we were able to figure out that 1 and 2 are corn, the other ones are soybean, for example. There's different chemicals used because there's different pests. Now, these red squares, we're digging into information about what other chemicals can be used surrounding the site. We're not just concerned about those drift triangles. We're concerned about whatever else is also around the site that could be getting into the habitat. So again, just an example. This is still source. This is all source. This is all exposure. Now, another part of exposure is, what I love. This is what I love about what we do is we need to understand the species life history and the species ecology. So wrapping in life history and ecology with insecticide use on the landscape and toxicity of insecticides, that is all important to understand your risks. So here we have our life history, and this is Phil probably already presented this to you, so I can just run through this very quickly. But the key point is it's important to know that you can have different exposure routes, and that will be impacting different phases of your non-target species of interest. So for the Poweshiek skipperling, we have their life stage here. We can start with the adult. Their flight stage is 2 to 4 weeks in June and July. Well, when you're thinking about ecological risk, you need to think about what chemicals are used during that time and what is the exposure route. So for the adults, the exposure route could possibly be through their food. What are they feeding on? They're feeding on nectar. If that flower has insecticides in it, that could be an exposure route to the adults. Then we have our eggs in midsummer, and then we have our larval stages. This species in particular spends the majority of its time in its larval phase. Its larval phase is fall, winter, spring. So when you're thinking about risk assessment, you need to think about what chemicals are used during those times. And then the routes of exposure could be dermal, so if the chemical is landing directly on the individual, or it could be dietary. So again, if it's on the plant or if it's in the plant and that larva is eating that, it will be ingesting this chemical. So that's the other route of exposure. So this is all part of our risk assessment that we're doing. Again, I just wanted to show you where we are. We're still determining the source, pathways, and effects. That's exposure. That takes a lot of time and a lot of thought, and it's the most important aspect to this. So our next two levels are risk evaluation, and then finally we get to risk management. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but we have, in order to look at the toxicity of the chemicals, we did go out in the field and we collected samples. So we took samples of plants at 2 different times last year. This was very basic screening level approach. We hope to do this. We hope to do this even more next year and the following years. We don't have the data back yet. The samples are at the lab, but we are looking for a number of different insecticides. So we're screening these for a number of different pesticides that could be an exposure to the species. Once we have our information back, then we can get into literature. We don't have a lot of information on the toxicity of these chemicals directly to lepidopteran. What we do have is bee information, and we do have other information that Chris talked to you about. So we will be looking at and comparing what we find in the field to what's known through lab toxicity tests as thresholds. And then we will be doing our risk evaluations similar to what Chris talked to you about. So this is my last slide, and I just kind of want to wrap this up here in showing you how this is all related. So we have our risk assessment, risk management framework up here. So this is what we're constantly circling in. This is what we're always working in. And this is what some of our risk management actions, this is just a very basic list. We have a lot of things that we're going to try to do. But I want to highlight how important it is, and this is how we're approaching this. The science and the data that we're collecting for this Poweshiek Skipperling risk assessment is going to feed into the larger picture of what we're really trying to have an impact on. That's these 2 categories, regulatory and then also pest management support. And so some examples of how we're doing this is we're going to continue to work on our own drift model. The information that we're working on our drift information that that Michigan Natural Features Inventory is working on that I showed you, but also some of the work that Eric and colleagues at Minnesota Zoo that they're doing is going to help us answer questions about drift. And if we are asking ourselves the right questions and collecting the data the right way, this could have a much larger impact, not just on what we're doing in Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin. This could impact the EPA's drift models, which has an impact nationally. So this is what I'm hoping that we can start thinking about in terms of what science decisions do we need to make that have a bigger impact, not just in our state, but at the process level, at the EPA registration level, because they need information from us in order to refine their models, which has a national impact. So that's what we're trying to do with the Poweshiek Skipperling risk assessment. And these are just some of the things that we're doing. Buffers, we're talking about lab toxicity tests. Again, if we can test on surrogate species, that information not only helps us, it helps EPA, and it helps the entire pesticide registration process nationally. I think that's pretty much it. That's all I have. Claire, hopefully that was clear.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.